everyone. This is a review of the negotiations learnings from day 1 and 2. This is intended to support the topics and the ideas that we discussed in our first 2 days of class. It is an optional part of the course, but it may help you to understand your slides if at all, if you're having if you're not able to recall or remember, or if there are bits of the slides that we didn't go over explicitly in class. This should be helpful. All right, so let's just quickly go over some of this material. On day 1, we talked about learning the language of negotiations. We went over some specific terms that are within the negotiations context. We also looked at single versus multi-issue negotiations, and we'll talk in just a moment about some of the definitions that we use to talk about these two different types of negotiation. On day 2, we talked about a range of issues, including relationships, emotions, ethics, and through your self-assessment, we talked about individual differences. So let's jump right into it and review some of the concepts from class. In our first negotiation, you bought a house. And in buying a house, we came to understand some learnings about distributive negotiations. Now, distributive negotiations are types of negotiations where one person, in order to claim additional value, has to take that value from the other party. They are zero-sum negotiations where there are winners and losers. We are talking about scarce resources. This is in contrast to the type of negotiation that we did later on in our time together, where there was a potential for mutual gains, for win-win solutions, for creativity, for expanding the pie. Okay, so this is a very basic definition of distributive versus integrative negotiations. Now, within our distributive framework, we talked about the features of the bargaining range. We talked about the fact that the bargaining range is determined by a few points. One point being the target point, and that's the point where the negotiator would like to finish. That's the goal, the aim of the negotiation. It's a realistic idea, but certainly one that has a bit of hopefulness in it. Then there's the resistance point. And this is the point where the negotiator is indifferent to the deal, otherwise known as the walkaway point. We also talked about the power of the first offer and the fact that the first offer can act as an anchor, and we'll come back to that idea in a moment. But we talked about the first offer as being an important number within a negotiation, especially as it relates to the bargaining range. So in this particular negotiation in buying a house, we used these different terms to determine what our ZOPA was, our zone, the zone of possible agreement, zone of potential agreement sometimes, ZOPA. Now, you have a positive ZOPA if the seller's reservation price is lower than the buyer's reservation price. If it is not lower than the buyer's reservation price, then we do not have any overlap. We have no ZOPA and there's no potential for a deal. This might be the case sometimes when you're having a very frustrating conversation with somebody within a negotiation and you're not able to identify any possibility for deal making. It could be because a ZOPA doesn't exist. Right, so you can see in this chart here, we have the buyer's aspiration price and the seller's aspiration price at the extreme ends. And in between, we have a seller's reservation price and a buyer's reservation price defining this area that is circled, which is our ZOPA. We also talked about in class the fact that the reservation prices determine our ZOPA, and often we dance around in order to find those parameters, those lines, and we end up splitting the difference. And we talked about that the fact that the split the difference strategy is a strategy that we do not want to fall upon incidentally, that it is something that we would only want to do if it is well considered, we've thought it out, and there's a good reason for it. Essentially what we're saying is that once you come to understand how to find the zone of potential agreement and you're able to identify it within a negotiation, there's an opportunity for you to take more of the bargaining range, more of the value out of the negotiation by continuing to negotiate within the zone of potential agreement. Okay, what else did we talk about? We also talked about, as I alluded to earlier, the importance of first offers. We had this question of when do you make the first offer? Well, you make the first offer when you have a good amount of information. And the reason for that is because the final agreement, the final value that you will end up in, that you will agree upon at the end of a negotiation, is closer to the first offer, the first number put on the table, than it is to any other value that we see within a negotiation. This is because first offers has the potential to act as anchors. And often what we see is people move not based on their own target price or their own reservation price, but they make movements based on the signals they receive from the other side. And in particular, this idea, the first offer, the question we start to ask ourselves as a negotiator on the other side of the table is not how close is this to my target price, but how much should I get closer? How much closer do I need to get to that anchor in order for it to make a deal? Right, so it starts to influence how we make our decisions. If you have a lot of information within a negotiation, you have a good sense of what the zone of potential agreement is. You want to give yourself an opportunity to set an anchor. And if you are setting an anchor, the place in which you'd want to set that is in the sweet spot. That is the area just outside of the bargaining zone, but not so far outside the bargaining zone that it ends the negotiation, that it offends the other side, just far enough out that it allows you to bargain yourself back into the zone of potential agreement on the side that benefits you, right? All right, so the other concept that we talked about with regards to basic or distributive negotiations that applies, of course, to other negotiations is the BATNA, the best alternative to a negotiated agreement. The better your BATNA, the greater your power. So your BATNA is one of your primary sources of power within a negotiation, and you always want to make sure that before you go into a negotiation that you understand what your BATNA is, and that you even work to improve your BATNA. So there might be an opportunity for you to increase your options, to research other opportunities, and to make sure that you are very aware of the possibilities. And so that you're able to select the best alternatives. Next, we talked about concessions and the idea that concessions are an important part of a negotiation in that they define the process and they help you to come towards outcomes. So they send signals to the other side of the table. We talked about the fact that the pattern of concession making can both signal intents to cooperate, and it can send other signals, such as it can send the signal that you're getting close to your reservation point. We know that when concessions start to slow in time and also start to get smaller, that we are getting closer to somebody's reservation price. We know that concessions are a good way to build trust or to share information within a negotiation. So concessions represent for us this dilemma that we talked about a great deal of in our time together, the dilemma of honesty and the dilemma of trust, right? You want to be honest and open and share information within a negotiation as a way to try and find good solutions, but at the same time, you don't want to give up so much that you end up being taken advantage of. Right, so there's this balance that you have to walk when you're negotiating. We also started to uncover a few tactics within our negotiations. Now, tactics are the types of strategies that are somewhat they exist in what we were calling the gray zone, this space where it's game playing. And the problem with tactics is that often they can frustrate people within a negotiation. They can make you appear to be inauthentic. They can have implications for your reputation. So tactics are risky within negotiations. They are not, you need to really consider whether this is how you want to negotiate, first of all, and also the potential consequences for you as a negotiator. Some of the tactics that we might see over our time together include good cop, bad cop, where you yourself might flip from being aggressive to being nice to being aggressive to being nice, or you might have two people within a negotiation do that. Low ball, high ball, where you offer extreme opening offers that are false, that are not rooted in any any real finding or real rationale. The bogey is where you pretend that something is important to you when it's not, in order to try and take advantage of the other person's position or priority. The nibble is where if the negotiation is going very well and everybody's feeling very good about it, where you try and get a little something extra simply because everybody's feeling good and celebrating the fact that the negotiation is going on well. There's also intimidation. So this is flexing power in some ways by trying to be angry or flexing. Legitimacy would be around enforcing a contract or making people feel guilty for some way in which they behaved. Aggressive behavior in general is a tactic. And finally, the last one on this slide is a snow job. This is where, as you can picture, a snow job is where you're covered in snow. Well, it's where you just dump information on somebody, hoping that the quantity of information that they're receiving confuses them or obscures their ability to negotiate. Okay. Finally, within our first set of negotiations, one of the main points that we learned was the importance of preparing, knowing your own position, your own interests, your own reservation point, not losing sight of that, and knowing your BATNAs. And then also thinking about the possibilities for your opponent and understanding your own opponent's perspective and how that additional information can be critical to negotiating success. So the learning points from our first negotiation together: plan for negotiations, know your reservation price, anticipate your opponent's reservation price. Develop your BATNA. Know that first offers can act as anchors or insults or both. Remember that concessions beget concessions. So if you give something up, you can set yourselves on a pattern of concession making. Remember that information is power, so as much research as you can do in advance can benefit you. And then hardball tactics are common within negotiations, but they are not without their problems. So this is something you want to really consider and understand, that you might be sitting across the table from somebody who is exhibiting them. All right, so after our first negotiation, we moved into a second negotiation. Here is where we negotiated new recruit. Now, some of the core elements of new recruit were that we were introduced to the fact that when you have multiple issues on the table, it's a complex negotiation, certainly, but there's opportunity for some creativity within the deal making. So within this negotiation, we identified that this is an integrative negotiation, so that's the umbrella term, but within the negotiation, we just determined that there are integrative issues, distributive issues, and compatible issues. So there are issues that we can trade off, the integrative issues. There are issues that are simply push-pull, that are distributive, that where we have differing expectations, or we have the opposing priorities on these issues. And then compatible issues to which that we entirely agree upon, which can sometimes be surprising to people, because when you sit down at the table, you assume that everything that I gain, I have to take from you. Well, here, if you want to review this, these are the point distributions for both parties in new recruit. So it gives you a sense of what it looks like to have integrative, compatible, and distributive issues. So you can take your time if you want to pause the video and take a look at this, or you can look at your own sheet. There it is. So this begs the question. So now we learn from new recruit that it's really helpful to share information. But what can you share? So we start to walk this balance of the negotiator's dilemma, the dilemma of trust, and the dilemma of honesty a little more carefully. We understand that we need to be able to identify trade-offs and identify opportunities for growing the pie, but at the same time, we don't want to give away everything because, of course, we will be taken advantage of. So if both sides strategically misrepresent their value on trade-offs, then inefficient contracts will result. Negotiators' individual gain is not hindered by revealing priority among issues, so saying this is the most important thing to me or this is not important to me, But revealing preferences for specific alternatives on a particular issue may lead to a disadvantage. So you might not want to reveal right away that I want Atlanta or I want option A, but you could say option A is really important, or job assignment is very important to me. Right? So there's a subtle difference there. So creating and claiming value are the two parts of a negotiation that we talked about. There are a series of efficient solutions that are possible, and they can only be realized if you're able to maximize your joint gain. You both have the potential to get high scores, and then this is where value claiming comes in. Once you've created value, you need to spend some time reaping or winning over the value that you have created. So again, the negotiator's dilemma is this non-separability of the integrative and the distributive aspects of a negotiation. That we know that once we've spent some time creating value, it must be claimed. And there are times that we do know that the skills required for these two pieces of the negotiation differ. So tactics that can be used to claim value often interfere with value creation. And vice versa. So this is another dilemma within negotiations, right? So just to highlight again some of the hallmarks of distributive and integrative negotiations, we went over this with our first negotiation, but certainly we have single versus multiple issues, win-lose versus win-win. In distributive, you're really aiming to maximize your individual gain. In integrative, you're aiming to maximize joint gain. In distributive, you really do have opposing interests, but in integrative, there are converging interests. There are compatible issues and there are complementary issues or integrative issues. In distributive negotiations, we're often talking about a short-term relationship, but in integrative negotiations, we're talking about a longer-term relationship. Now, one of the arguments that can be made about integrative negotiations is that integrative negotiations should not harm your relationship. At worst, your relationship should stay the same following an integrative negotiation. But ideally, what you should be aiming for is an opportunity to improve your relationship through the negotiation, such that the next time you negotiate with one another, it will be even better and more efficient, and you can create even more value. The learning points from the second negotiation: don't assume opposing interests. Just because you're sitting down at the negotiation table does not mean that everything I receive I have to take from you. Look for opportunities to create value, to enlarge the pie by identifying trade-offs. Listen for when somebody is saying something is important to them, and then understand when there are differing priorities. Using a scoring system can be quite useful so that you really clearly have identified your rank order of items and how the issues fit together for you. It helps you to keep track of all the issues on a table when you are dealing with complex negotiations. Get as much information as you can. You can do so by building trust and sharing information. You can ask questions and listen to the answers. We talked about the importance of listening within negotiations. And also give away some information as a way of signaling your intent to cooperate and hopefully setting off a cascade of information sharing where you share some and they share some. Be firm on your interests, but be open to options, right? So understand the difference between positions and interests, and be firm on your interests. You want to ensure that your interests are satisfied, but be flexible in how you get there. Try post-settlement settlements. So this is a term that refers to the fact that you might get to the end of a negotiation, agree on a deal, and if things have gone very well, you might say, we have a deal. This is a contract we'll both sign unless we are able to find more value within this negotiation. How about we keep talking, and if we can find a spot where both of us benefit, we'll make small changes to the deal. If we do not, we will go ahead and sign the deal that we have on the table. That's a post-settlement settlement. It can take the pressure off within a negotiation. You know that you have a viable deal on the table, but it gives you an opportunity to help identify those opportunities for mutual gain without the pressure of trying to get to a resolution. All right, so something that we talked about in class that was a thread through the day was this idea of power and influence. So I'll talk about it briefly here, but certainly these are ideas that will be that will be thoroughly covered in your readings and in future conversations that we have in class, and in some of the videos that I've linked to the website. So, what are your sources of power? Well, the first one we talked about, and we saw a great deal, this idea of reciprocity. If you give something, it is a way of receiving. It encourages this sharing of either information or resources. So reciprocity is a useful one. Now, the rest of these are good things to keep in mind, so that you have ways of making strong arguments for your requests to accompany your proposals. There'll be a link on the website to a video by a gentleman named Robert Cialdini, who talks at great length about each of these sources of influence. But very quickly, social proof refers to the idea that if you can demonstrate that somebody else shows value for whatever it is that you are trying to argue, that can persuade the other party. Commitment and consistency is another space where there's an opportunity for influence. If you can get somebody to agree to an idea in its early form, and then when the specifics are put on the table, they'll want to cooperate because they agreed sometime earlier, right? So if you can get people to agree to something in theory, if I was to propose this type of agreement, is that something you can live with? If you can get them to agree to the kind of the theoretical idea, then it'll be much easier to agree on the details later on. We talked at length about the idea of liking. If you can engender some sort of relationship or some sort of mutual liking, that's a source of influence. Authority, of course, is a source of influence. This is the legitimate power. And then finally, scarcity. If you have something that there isn't very much of, that is unique, then you have an opportunity to have influence on others. The other sources of influence have to do with where you are in a social network, who you are. If you are more central to the network, this focuses on the horizontal relationships, the relationships of people at the same level as you. That is a way to have influence within that network, is to be a hub, to be a person who is well connected within that network. If you are flexible in how you do work and how you get things done, it's a source of positional power. If you are highly visible, so if people know your skills, they know that what you can accomplish, this is a good way of seeking positional power vertically with people who you manage and people who manage you, who you report to. And if the work that you do is highly relevant to the outcomes you're seeking, all of these things can be sources of power, both in your broader work that you try to accomplish, but also when it comes time to trying to have some influence on how things work or within a negotiation. So the next thing that I want to talk about before going into the last negotiation, you have a few slides that refer to this idea of not wanting to ask the question, or not wanting to initiate a negotiation, not wanting to ask for more. We talked about that at length in class. I encourage you to watch this video that I've posted a link to on the course website by Adam Galinsky, where Dr. Galinsky talks about our resistance or our reluctance for speaking up, our reluctance for asking for something, and the factors that what defines that, what makes that the case. And he makes the argument that we are reluctant to speak up because we're lower in power, right? So when he asks the question, when can I express my interests? When can I make an ambitious ask? And when can I ask something risky? And essentially what he says is that when we have lower power within any context, our range of behaviors is restricted. The types of things we can get away with are restricted. And he gives a bunch of suggestions around expanding our range. One thing that we talked about in class was this idea of advocating for others. Often we're not able to ask for things for ourselves, but we can ask for things for somebody else. You can also expand your range by effectively using perspective taking. So trying to understand the problem from the other person's perspective, giving them what they want as a way of being able to ask for what you want. So being able to make to come up with good solutions that meet everybody's needs. Signal your flexibility. Gain allies, so asking others for advice. And display your own expertise. So I'll leave you to watch the Adam Galinsky video where he does a very good job of explaining how each of these strategies can be effective at increasing the possible range of behaviors for you and allowing you to make the ask when you otherwise wouldn't want to. Finally, the last negotiation that we talked about, or that we worked through, was we had two more negotiations, right? Well, the second last negotiation that we worked through was tax oil. You'll remember that tax oil was about buying a gas station. Some of the elements of tax oil are on this slide, where I've outlined here for you the BATNA, the reservation price, and the interests of all the parties. So this is a difficult negotiation because the ZOPA doesn't exist here if you just look at the numbers. There's very little ZOPA. It's actually a non-existent ZOPA. You're only able to find the ZOPA if you put something else into the deal. If you put something into the deal, such as in this particular slide, I've added the job offer upon return. If you're able to find something else in the environment that you can add that satisfied the station owner's interests, right, which are to get away, to be able to go off on the boat, and also satisfy the tax oil's representatives' interests. So this negotiation led to quite a few impasses. And what can cause an impasse? Well, here are a few things that can cause an impasse. Escalation of commitment to position. So if you get stuck on the numbers, just the numbers, and lose sight of what you're actually trying to accomplish within a negotiation, the holding and then hold as we hold tighter and tighter to the numbers, we're less likely to move off of that conversation. This is the escalation of commitment, and it can cause an impasse. The need to win can cause an impasse. The idea that you're in it to accomplish something and it's not about the other party's interests. They are opposite to you, believe they're opposite to yours. I need to win this negotiation. And so that can cause an impasse. Holding positive illusions and unrealistic expectations or aspirations. And then holding negative views of your opponent. Any of these things can really support an impasse within any negotiation. So in integrative negotiations, what we want to work hard to do is to separate people from problems, focus on interests, not positions, generate multiple possibilities, and base our results on objective standards rather than interpreting how we want to accomplish something based on who's sitting across the table from us. Really trying to focus in on what is a good solution to this problem. An objective standard, and how can I argue for one solution versus another solution. The advantages of integrative agreements, again, we're kind of going over this making arguments to support this type of negotiation again. We see improved outcomes. We see stable agreements, so agreements that aren't tenuous or fall apart without a contract. We see improved implementation, people who are willing to commit to the agreements and move forward with them, and stronger relationships following an agreement. But there is, of course, the negotiator's dilemma, the fact that anything that is created has to be claimed, and we can see tactics interfere with our ability to be successful within a negotiation. That when we create value, we become vulnerable to these tactics or to value claiming strategies, right? So again, this is we see that caution arise in this negotiation as well. Something else that we see within this negotiation is how important it is to cooperate. Now, I made the distinction in class that it's not about compromise, it's about cooperation. Compromise is the split the difference, let's split everything in half scenario. That is not what we're looking for here. Cooperation is where we are able to identify ways in which we can both benefit. The classic example of this is the economist's prisoner's dilemma. So you likely have all heard of this before. This is the classic case, and if you haven't heard of it, you've seen it in a movie or on television. The classic case where you catch two people and who you believe have committed a crime together, and you don't have enough evidence to convict any one of them. But if one of them testifies against the other, then you'll be able to put the other person in jail. So here's the matrix that explains how things can happen. If they cooperate and neither confess, they get a very short sentence, 2 years, as there's really not enough evidence to support anything. Or maybe even though I could have put that they would be set free, but let's say there's some concession made by cooperating and it's 2 years. If one person confesses and the other person does not confess, the person who confesses gets 0 years. They testify against the other person who then gets 10 years. So it's a really bad outcome for the other party, and vice versa. But if they both confess, they get 5 years each, right? So the mutual cooperation ends up with overall the best strategy for both people. Right? There is the opportunity, of course, for one person to take all of the value by confessing and ratting on the other person, but you don't know what the other person will do. So you could end up in jail for 5 years under this scenario. So mutual cooperation is a strategy that assures the best outcome for both parties. So that's the prisoner's dilemma. We apply it to the negotiator's dilemma. If we both are focused on value creation, we end up with good outcomes. Everybody can walk away from the table with reasonable outcomes, as opposed to these mediocre or terrible outcomes, right? And now we do have, if you focus on value claiming and the other person focuses on value creation, certainly you end up in a space where you could have a great outcome. But it is, as I remind you, at a cost, right? The cost being a cost to your reputation, a decrease in the person's satisfaction with the negotiation process, and a reluctance that they will negotiate with you in future. Right? So there are consequences that are unattractive in a distributive context. You might be perfectly fine living within a distributive context. So to keep that in mind. So how do you resolve this dilemma? Prepare for integrative and distributive opportunities. Analyze your own interests. Avoid this perception that there's only a fixed pie, that everything I take that I have to get from you, that there's only opposing interests. Know your BATNA, know your reservation price, and know your objective arguments. Now you want to also balance cooperation and competition. You want to focus on both value creation and value claiming. So build trust. So you don't want to walk right in the door and behave in ways that are overly trusting, but build it as part of an exchange or an interaction. And then ask for your share of the outcome, right? Watch out for unilateral. Watch out for behaviors that are clearly distributive and one-sided, and make sure that if somebody is behaving in a way that is entirely distributive, that you are responding in that way. Okay. All right. So there's a summary of our first day together that we went over a little bit in class. Our day 2, we started with a conflict situation, where we talked about the fact that this is Viking Investments, that you can negotiate from multiple places. And I find this visual very helpful to illustrate the different spaces from which you can negotiate. You can negotiate from place of power, right? I have more money. I am stronger. I carry more of the resources. I am right, that we talked about the contract in this case. I'm right, you are wrong. Or we can negotiate from a place of interests. Now, there will be times where you'll negotiate from any of these environments, any of these rings within the circle. But the way to a solution, the way forward, is an interest-based negotiation. In this negotiation, we had Pat and Sandy, and here on this chart you will see their interests, their rights, and their power. Right? Interestingly, we discovered that Sandy's source of power was bankruptcy, which is an unusual idea, that something that is actually a weakness for Sandy within the negotiation becomes real leverage, because that is once we talk about that outcome and understand the consequences of it, it's quite clear that everybody loses if we end with bankruptcy. So other considerations, the things that you want to think about within this particular negotiation. We talked about transaction costs, the satisfaction with the various outcomes, effects on relationship, and the likelihood of a recurrence of the various outcomes. Some of you are concerned about how this happened, why this happened, and could this happen in the future, and what does that mean for your relationship with Pat or Sandy, right? So we also spent some time talking about, well, what happens if somebody is sticking to contract or rights or power? How do we get them back to an interest-based discussion? We brainstormed a bunch of approaches that were very useful. One of them was don't reciprocate with a right. So this is kind of a basic one. Don't reciprocate with an argument that is power-based, right? So try and shift the way that you're talking to one another. Offer a rights-based argument or a rights-based intervention. Don't get personal. You might reciprocate, but then couple your statement with an interest-based proposal. Or you might try a process intervention so that would be something like, instead of yelling at each other, we could consider so-and-so. Okay. Despite all of our efforts to try and move rights-based arguments to interest, there are times where people won't budge. So when do you use rights or power? Well, you use rights or power when the other party just won't come to the table. Perhaps even when the negotiators, you're at the table, but you get to an impasse and all attempts to focus on interests have been exhausted. Or when you're moving towards an agreement and you're now leaving the value creation phase of the negotiation and you're moving into the value claiming phase of a negotiation, you might want to shift your approach. And instead of focusing solely on interests, start to move towards power-based arguments. Finally, we started to introduce this idea of an agent. It seemed in Viking Investments that there might be a need at times. This might be an opportunity or a space where an agent might make sense. So when do we use agents? We use them when they have some sort of technical expertise, whether that's legal or financial. Use them when they have a specific skill that you don't have. You might use them if you are too emotionally involved. As we know, emotions can really affect how a negotiation plays out. Or you might use them when your time is more valuable than that of a representative, when it's just not worth your while to be part of the negotiation. We also talked about the third-party options, arbitration, mediation, where an arbitrator, they're useful because they can shape and determine an outcome, and the outcome is binding, whereas mediation can help by being the person who is able to have candid conversations with each party, understand the interests, and propose solutions that ultimately both parties would find attractive. All right, so those were our learnings from Viking Investments. And then we moved on to difficult negotiations, and we talked about this is still part of Viking Investments. We talked about within difficult negotiations, how do we respond to things like hardball tactics, right? So what do you do if somebody's just using tactics? Well, you could call them on it. You could try and ignore the tactics. You could respond. This is where you meet power with power. Or offer some sort of process intervention, offer some sort of productive way forward. Similarly, what do you do if the other person just has higher power? Well, first you protect yourself. Secondly, you find other ways of improving your power, perhaps by improving your BATNA. So the job offer would be a good one here. You have a job offer. The employer has the upper hand in this case, but if you are able to get another offer in your back pocket, that improves your ability to negotiate. The third point here is know your threshold. So if you're negotiating with somebody with high power, know what your walk away point is, so that they will be able, of course, to do well within the negotiation by flexing power. But at the same time, you want to know what your limits are. You don't want them to be able to take more than their fair share of the negotiation pie. Or you could try strategies for redistributing power and correcting the imbalance, finding ways of increasing your own power, either by using some of the influence strategies we talked about earlier, by having good arguments, by being very prepared. All of these things can start to shift power within a negotiation. When you're at an impasse, some of the other strategies we talked about, where take a step back, think about what is, so you know that you're in the middle of the negotiation, it's not working. In your own mind, take a step back and observe what's happening and offer some sort of suggestion for how to move forward. If you're at an impasse, start listening. This is a time where it can be really helpful to refocus your activities, not just on argumentation, but on listening quite carefully, so that you understand what the person is trying to accomplish. You might try and reframe the problem. We talked about the use of frames within negotiations, and that everybody might approach the problem in a different way. I think the video that I've assigned to you for the in between classes 2 and 3, the Stanford Guide to Negotiating, has a really clear example of a frame and somebody being stuck in a frame, and how reframing the problem can help to inch the negotiation or move the negotiation forward. Finally, taking a break is also a great solution that you might try. All right, so now we are on the final negotiation, which is Bullard houses. Called also Villard houses in the United States, in New York City, now the New York City Palace Hotel. So this negotiation, really, the key learning points are all around ethics. So what are ethics? They are social standards for what's right or wrong in a particular situation. Now, we need to contrast morals with standards. We all have our own moral compass. This is a personal standard for what's right and what's wrong, and they vary slightly from person to person. But within negotiations, we are clearly concerned with ethics and behaving ethically, because, and the reason why it's really important to address this topic head on, because sometimes negotiation contexts, because it is a more competitive environment, are misunderstood to be a space where it is okay to behave in ways which is unethical. So the ethical dilemma is that the potential for economic gain is in conflict with your social obligations to one another. So there are lots of ways to think about ethical frames. We hear people talk about the end results, that it's ethical if the ends justify the means. We hear people talk about duty. You're obliged to behave according to a certain set of social standards. We hear about social contracts. People talk in terms of social contracts. What's appropriate conduct for your community, the norms in which you are working. You're working in a collective bargaining environment. What's the social contract here? And then, of course, there are the ethics that are rooted in who you are, your own conscience. And all of these are things that you want to keep in mind when you're planning for and moving through negotiations, because negotiations are these heated environments where you're expected to respond quickly. There are moments where you can be pushed a little bit, so you want to always make sure that you are keeping your own understanding of what's appropriate and what's not appropriate close at hand. There are a variety of unethical behaviors that we see quite commonly within negotiations. So this could be selective disclosure and or exaggeration. So two sides of the same coin. In giving only a piece of information, indicating that that's all you have. I don't know anymore. versus exaggerating to a large extent something that you know or don't know. There could also be misrepresentation. This is deceiving somebody on, this is my bottom line, this is my resistance point, this is as low as I'm willing to go, right? That could be viewed as unethical. There are false threats, so we might call this playing chicken if we were talking about tactics. Take it or leave it. I'm going to leave the negotiation unless you accept this offer. And then they don't accept the offer and you continue to negotiate. That kind of damages your credibility to some extent. There's false promises. So an insincere concession offer. If you do this, I'll do this. But then when push comes to shove, you don't do it. And then there's the issue of inflicting indirect and intentional harm. So trying to take advantage of others, trying to take something away from others. This can also be viewed as unethical behavior. Now, we often see excuses and rationalizations for this behavior, right? It was unavoidable. My favorite is, all's fair in love and war. It was harmless. I did it to avoid something even worse. I did it to provide a greater good. In this situation, it was okay, right? So these are some of the things that we hear as rationalizations. But there are huge consequences for unethical behavior. If you behave unethically, then there's increased likelihood that others will behave unethically towards you. There are fairly significant consequences for your reputation. It really damages it. And that it can also lead to you feeling badly about yourself, right? Leaving the negotiation, regretting something that you did within the negotiation context. So, some things to think about. Now, there might be times where you are sitting at the table and you believe the person across from you is dealing with you unethically. How do you deal with that? Well, some of the things you want to do, make sure that you're prepared. If you feel that you're not getting full answers, you're not satisfied with the arguments or what's being put on the table, then continue to ask probing questions. You might be in a space where somebody is trying to deceive you. We talked about the use of contingency contracts. Well, so if I don't believe what you're saying, then I might say, okay, if that's the case, if you can guarantee me X, if you can write that down, I'm willing to sign the paper, right? So if-then statements in contracts that said, if this is true, then this will happen. That can be a way forward. Be direct in your questioning. So be clear on the types of answers that would satisfy you. If you really feel that somebody is deceiving you, call them out on it and encourage them to tell the truth. Now, how do you avoid behaving in ways that are ethical? As I say, it's everything. Things happen in the moment that are, especially if you're cornered or you're feeling that pressured to give a response, it can lead to unethical behaviors. So you want to remember a few things during the course of a negotiation. Remember your reputation. Be prepared to answer difficult questions, and be direct and clear about which questions you will not answer. Right? So if you're not able to answer a question, that's your answer. I'm not able to answer the question, as opposed to trying to come up with some other rationale or even saying that you don't have the answer. If you have an answer but you're not able to share it, I think it encourages a great deal of respect to be truthful about that. All right. That is the end of what we went through on our first day together. I hope this video is helpful to you as you review some of the learnings from our first couple days together. And I look forward to seeing you in class in a few weeks. Take care. Bye-bye.